Hi, today is June 2nd. We're here with Brandon Harris today for the Houston Asian American Archive. First, I want to ask, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. There's a lot going on with like the pandemic and like the protests that have been going on. So my mind's kind of like all over the place right now. How
Yeah,
are you doing?
good, same. It's so eventful.
Yeah.
Yeah. But okay, I'll get started. When and where were you born?
So I was born in Houston, Texas on October 16th, 1995.
Okay. And how would you describe the household that you grew up in?
My household was very traditionally American. I think my parents, they wanted to like help me assimilate better into like society and like with my peers at school. So I think my upbringing has been pretty American, but I also think it enforces the idea of being Vietnamese and like kind of being an outcasted by growing up in like a suburban, predominantly white neighborhood and enforces like the idea of what it means to be an American.
Yeah, can you describe the neighborhood that you grew up in?
Yeah, I grew up in a neighborhood in Northwest Houston. A lot of my peers in school were white. It was like a typical middle class residential area. Um, yeah, it was but it was relatively close to like the Chinatown of Houston, which I think was a good spot for us and for my upbringing because we would always go eat like lunches with the family in Chinatown, and we still had that connection to our Asian heritage, but also this American heritage, I guess.
Yeah. Um, Yeah, so do you have like any memorable experiences like going to Chinatown? Like did you go like every month or so?
Yeah, we would go pretty often. I would say like normally we would go to church and then go either to Chinatown or like a Vietnamese restaurant nearby. I also worked at a Vietnamese restaurant as my first job
Mhm.
too, so we would also eat there as well.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah. Like yeah, same background as me honestly. Have you heard of the Woodlands?
Yeah, I worked in the Woodlands after high school
Oh,
and
really?
bartended out there. Is that
Oh,
where you're
cool.
from?
Yeah, that's where I'm from. But like yeah, like all the Asians go to like Houston, Chinatown, that area, like, you
Hmm.
know, for all the Asian stuff.
That's where it's at.
Yeah. But yeah, like in school and stuff, did you feel any like conflicts with that your identity brought you, like while you were like growing up in the American school system and stuff?
Yeah, I remember being in like elementary school and like my mom would pack me like Vietnamese food for lunch and then other people would be like, "What is that? Like why are you eating that?" And like it really like made me insecure about being Vietnamese.
Hmm.
So then I like a little brat that I am was like, "I want Lunchables.
Yeah.
I want to be like my friends."
Yeah.
And looking back, I'm just like, wow. Now I'm like, I want Vietnamese food all the time.
Yeah,
Like,
same. Yeah.
and
Like
then like I think like in school as well, they don't really teach about the Vietnam War. Like I think growing up, I remember like maybe it was like one lesson or like one class period, and they don't really like touch on it. So I think that's another thing that the school system tends to like forget about in society as well.
mhm. Do you remember like if that lesson, like did you remember feeling like everyone like staring at you or something or like it was accurate or not?
I think people were just like, "Oh yeah, like aren't you Vietnamese?
Yeah.
Like were your families like refugees?"
Oh my God, yeah. Yeah. When you were growing up, what values were you raised with?
I think like when I was raised, I feel like we had a very like matriarchal family.
Mhm.
So it was like my grandma was like the number one ruler and like enforced us to be like, I guess they kind of enforced that like you need to be a doctor, you need to be a lawyer. growing up now that I'm an adult and not a doctor or a lawyer and
Yeah.
an artist instead, I think that now that I'm getting more like response to my art and like has made like a has made like I guess like a following or like people are interested in it,
Hmm.
I think they're more realizing that the my voice is important and like also sharing their voice too through me is important.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Yeah. So how did you become interested in creating art?
I in high school I've always been like creative growing up and like I always was like drawing and making art.
Mhm.
In high school is when I started taking photography classes and it kind of just like stuck and I actually just finished my my BFA program at University of Houston with the concentration of photography and digital media, but
Oh,
it wasn't in thanks. I haven't graduated yet because I still need like science
oh
classes that
yeah,
I like.
those class.
I was like, I'm not good at science. I'm gonna
Yeah,
just wait. But my program is, I'm finished with it, and I just
good.
finished my thesis project. But
Mhm.
I, yeah, like for me now, because when I first started taking photographs, it wasn't personal or wasn't deep or didn't really like mean something special to me.
Mhm.
And it was when I did a photo series on my grandmother that it kind of struck this chord in me, like because I really didn't know their story growing up. They didn't really tell me. It's
Mhm.
not something that they talked about. So after that, hanging out with my grandma, she kind of told me and like kind of like showed me a little bit more, and like I'm kind of like in the process of un un I guess like digging up this history that they don't talk about through
Mhm.
my work,
Mhm.
and now that's strictly what I focus on now.
That's cool. Yeah. So, um, what like, so would your grandma inspire your artwork, or like what inspires your art?
I think it definitely is inspired by my grandma and my family's personal histories and like their experience as war refugees. And then now it's kind of like taking that knowledge that I've learned from them and like applying it to like current refugee crisis or like what's going on in the world right now,
Yeah.
because I it's still happening. Like it's not the Vietnamese refugees, but there's so many other refugees that are still going through the same process.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So you mentioned like that photo series with your grandma. Is that when you kind of started digging into like themes like the immigrant experience and the Vietnamese diaspora? Or like have you always been like kind of thinking about that through your art?
That was actually like the starting point of like this whole project and like my whole work. Yeah, like it was like after I got that knowledge, I kind of like went on like a spiraling like emotional roller coaster and like kind of like unpacking all this like trauma and like what came and what was the outcome of all this. And then after that I just been doing a lot of research on the diaspora and just like focusing on like our community here in Houston,
Mhm.
because it's like so big and there's so much of us, and there's not many there's not many studies that focus on the South
Mhm.
with the Vietnamese refugees. It's mostly focused in like California. So
Mhm.
I want to like provide a voice for the people here, which is like the third largest Vietnamese population outside of Vietnam.
Mhm. Yeah. And yeah, you mentioned like contemporary issues surrounding like refugees and um, contributing a voice from like the southern side. So, what do you want to express through your art? And in what ways do you think art is a channel of like expressing yourself and activism?
I think all art is activism. So with my work, I want to like provide like a voice for these refugees and also like talk about the issues and like being an immigrant, being a refugee, such as like even applying for like citizenship. And like I have like friends who are like Hispanic whose mom can't who's been like living here and like working here for so long but hasn't had the opportunity to become a citizenship, and they're doing is like providing to our economy.
Hmm.
So it's like there's so many different things, and a lot of my work now I have been focusing a lot on like labor and
Hmm.
like the play that come like what like how refugees are so impacted by war, and how um how the labor that they do just to be here.
Yeah.
And like I've been focusing a lot on like nails and like how like most Vietnamese refugees come and they work in nails, including my family. When they first had like a business in Houston, they had a nail and like hair shop, which they still own, but now they just do hair
Oh,
because of like the chemicals,
oh yeah.
and it's like easier.
Yeah, so can you talk about how your family ended up in Houston?
Yeah, so my family's from a small village outside of Da Nang, Vietnam.
Hmm.
And after the war, like in 1975, when the war was like about to end,
Hmm.
they heard the Viet Cong was coming down from the north to the south, and that's when they were like, okay, we need to get out of here. My grandpa was also like in the South Vietnamese army, so they buried a lot of their documentations and photographs, concealing their identity in case they were to get caught or like found on their journey. But they went from where they lived, and then they traded all their gold and silver for a spot on a fishing boat in Vung Tau, which
Hmm.
was the closest beach to Ho Chi Minh. So they traveled their way down and got on the boat, which was going to take them to Ho Chi Minh, which was like where they heard that the Navy ships were there and they were taking refugees to America. So they were on the boat for like about a week, and my mom describes it as being like packed as like sardines, like people were just throwing up on each other, like
Oh my gosh, yeah.
yeah,
Mhm.
like going to the restroom on each other, like there was no food. And
Mhm.
once they got to Ho Chi Minh, they got onto a Navy boat, but on the boat they were like, um, you either have a choice to like throw out all your belongings so we can fit more refugees, or we're gonna like turn the boat back to Ho Chi Minh, and you can stay in Vietnam. So everyone on the boat decided that they wanted to go to America. So
Mhm.
they literally had like what they had on their backs, and that was it.
Mhm.
Um, they were on the boat for about a week, I believe, and then they took them to Guam for like an army camp for a couple more weeks
Mhm.
until they knew where to bring these refugees. And then they put my family on a plane to Fort Indiantown Gap in Pennsylvania, which was a refugee camp. And then they were looking for a sponsor for my family. So they found one, which was this doctor in New York, Dr. Gage, who took my family and my like extended family too
Mhm.
in 19, and they were there until 1978, which then my family like were able to, with the help of the Catholic Church, get a job, learn English, um, raise money for them to move out on their own when, because they heard that our relatives were in Houston. That's when they decided to make the move for themselves and move to Houston to be closer to other relatives.
Mhm.
Which when they were in Houston, they lived near in an apartment complex, like a 1 bedroom apartment complex that's near where I live now on
Oh
my
my god.
own. So it's
Yeah.
like full
Yeah,
circle.
full circle with moving. Yeah.
Yeah, and then they moved to Humble, like Houston,
Mhm.
and then uh, they all grew up and went their separate ways.
Yeah, like as you said earlier, like so much like labor and work, like such a long journey to get here, you know.
Hmm.
And what do you think your parents and your family's experiences, how do they impact you? Or like to you, what does the identity as a child of war refugees mean?
I think like I think trauma is
Mhm.
impact impacts me and like is ingrained in my DNA. And like I think growing up as a child of war refugees, you see things that and like you see how these elders react to things and how they are, and that's like their trauma. Even like I didn't notice it at like growing up, but now as an adult, I notice it as like trauma. Like I remember being young, and my mom wouldn't eat until me and my sister ate, and
Mhm.
I didn't think that was like weird until growing up now, and I was like, that's probably like a sign of trauma and like how like war is. Like you have to make sure your kids are fed before
Mhm.
you're fed. So
Mhm.
things like that, like little things.
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
And it
Like,
definitely impacts me now and it's on my mind all the time,
mhm,
and like how I am too.
mhm. Yeah, like I'm not sure if you're already familiar with this work, but I recently read The Best We Could Do by T Boy, and she
Mhm.
relives like a large fire. Well, she like talks about her family's experience in the Vietnamese diaspora, and she relives a large fire in her neighborhood, and like her first instinct was to immediately grab like her official state documents and then just leave the apartment without like caring about any of her other possessions. And she calls this her refugee reflux. Yeah, reflex.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So like, are there any moments growing up where you would consider like due to your family's identity as a refugee?
Any moments like that?
Yeah, like how has your parents' trauma like affected you?
I think it was also I think it was like just growing up and like how like my parents were very like I get not like stingy in a bad way, but like but
Yeah.
like very cautious with money and like
Yeah.
materialistic goods, and like not like it's like, oh, I want this toy at Toys R Us, like
Mhm.
no, you can't have this toy. Like I think it's like because not being at one point and not having anything and no belongings. I think there's a point now where it's like we, even though we still we have money and we have the opportunity if we wanted to buy this, we don't know what could happen next if we need to like run out and like use this money to big escape the country or something like
Mhm.
that.
Yeah, for sure. Like financial like security versus like insecurity and all that. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so um you mentioned like intergenerational trauma. And so how do you think your artwork helps you like process your family's intergenerational trauma? And what?
Yeah. So like throughout this whole process, especially with my grandma, when I spend time with her, it like I don't think she has even heard her own story for herself.
Mhm.
Like she knows the story, but she hasn't like unpacked it and like let it out. And I think throughout my work and include the inclusion of her is a sense of healing for her and healing for me and understanding my own identity and where I come from. So
Mhm.
I think that intergenerational trauma and like being tied so closely to it and being like the first generation that was born here has definitely impacted my work a lot.
Mhm.
and and she's been at like every show I've been, like she's been at all my talks, everything, and like she's like cried at them before, and like I think she wants her story to be known, and like once this once our family like wants people to know what they've gone through but doesn't have like the voice or the language
Yeah.
to even say it.
Mhm. Yeah. So, do you think the mainstream portrayal of migration, specifically like the Vietnamese diaspora, is accurate? Or like, what do you hope for people to understand more about what happened?
So I did a photo series called My Life Magazine
Mhm.
because a lot of when I was researching in the beginning phase of my work and my practice, all like the information and like all the documentation was by Americans.
Yeah.
And I was looking at these Life magazines, and they always portray the Vietnamese people as like weak, as like poor and dirty and like hopeless, and like there was like a white savior complex in all these imagery. So in the series that I did, I took these images and I projected them and like photographed them by inserting myself into the projections, kind of like reclaiming this and
Yeah.
kind of like reclaiming the history and
Hmm.
taking it out of the hands of these white Americans.
Hmm. Yeah, that sounds cool. Yeah. Um, so what other themes do you primarily explore in your artwork? I know you've already talked a lot about like labor and refugees in the Vietnamese diaspora, but would you want to expand upon that?
Yeah, another theme that I've been exploring throughout my work is land and like home and homeland and what does home mean.
Hmm.
And and in my project that I'm working on now, I'm exploring like the remains of Vietnamese refugees and like of the refugees throughout Houston and the Gulf Coast area,
Hmm.
and like what remains. And even if you look at like Chinatown now, it's kind of almost dilapidated. Like there's like barely any businesses in the Hong Kong mall still.
Hmm.
It's almost like surreal. Like, and
Yeah.
then like what's the future like? What's gonna happen after that's gone? Because the original Chinatown was in East Downtown, where
Yeah.
I live now. But then now, if you go back and look at it, like there's only like the remnants of the name and like the roofing.
Hmm.
So I'm kind of exploring like the traces of Vietnamese refugees and their like migration and where they ended up in Houston right now.
Yeah, it sounds really cool. So the current project you're working on, it's funded by the Houston Alliance and the IDEA Fund, and the English name is Oh Mother Vietnam, We're Still Here. Can you describe some
Yes.
detail about it? And what's the Vietnamese name, or how do you say
Mẹ Việt Nam ơi, chúng con vẫn còn đây.
it? Okay.
My Vietnamese is like not that great.
Yeah. Yeah.
Still working on Vietnamese. But yeah, the project was actually started when I was researching and I found this photograph of the KKK burning a wooden boat that says USS Viet Cong on the side of it in Seabrook, Texas, which is like 25 minutes away from my house.
Yeah.
And I was like so shocked because I knew that there was a lot of like oppression of Vietnamese refugees, but I didn't know about it being here and like documented here. So I wanted to create a project where I focus on like the resilience of the community here and like the tracing the migration and resettlement of Vietnamese refugees in the Houston and Gulf Coast area.
Mhm.
So I focused a lot on like Seabrook, Texas and the Gulf Coast. And then I focused on like East Downtown, which was Old Chinatown and New Chinatown in Bel Air area. And I focused on like these apartment complexes, which were like low income housing for Vietnamese refugees throughout like Southwest Houston. And then I focused on my family houses throughout Houston. And in the project, I'm collecting wooden pieces from these areas and creating a wooden boat that's 8 feet long out of these out of this found materials from this land. And then I also, because I just finished the boat for my thesis project, I took like flags of the South Vietnamese and like the current Vietnamese flag, and I like cut them into pieces and then woven them so sides of the boats are like woven together and like held together by thread. And throughout this process, I'm going to be filling the boat with land and soil from these areas and pulling this wooden boat throughout these areas,
Mm.
creating a performance. And then when I plan to exhibit the show, I want to do a performance where me and my grandma enter the space with the boat filled with the soil. And in the soil, it will be photographs and documents of my family's migration, kind of reenacting what they did when they escaped Vietnam, and we're gonna unbury those together and then plant plants native to Vietnam in the U.S. soil.
Mhm.
So it's kind of like funerary, but also
Yeah.
kind of like talking about land, talking about labor, exploring the ideas of migration and always migrating and like where's home, a sense of home.
That sounds super cool.
Thank you. I'm super excited for it. This is like my biggest project I have ever worked on, and I'm so happy and thankful for funding and the support from Houston Art Alliance and the Idea Fund. They've just been so helpful throughout the whole process.
Yeah, that's good to hear. Um, so how do you think this project addresses contemporary issues of migration?
I think for the project, a lot of people can relate
Hmm.
to migration through the lens of the Vietnamese diaspora, and it's it's like a history is that is being repeated but through a different lens,
Yeah.
you know. So I think hopefully the project will speak to the current refugees now, and like even I think it could also speak to like detention centers and
Mhm.
like Mexican immigrants and like all the people that are locked up by ICE and
Right.
like their struggle. And I hope that my family's history and my family's migration can be relatable, or like at least give them a sense of hope
Yeah.
for their future.
Yeah, for sure. So, how have you found people's responses to your past artwork? And how do you think like people who aren't familiar with the Vietnamese diaspora can also relate?
The overall response has been pretty well received throughout
Mhm.
the community in Houston. I think one issue that I see a lot in the Houston art scene is it's so it's like ran by white Americans, and like they typically prefer like to uplift their own,
Mhm.
and there's not really a lot of representation of Vietnamese artists or like Vietnamese refugee art or
Mhm.
art that deals with trauma
Mhm.
in the art scene. Like I've been lucky enough to show my work throughout Houston, but I feel like it's definitely been a journey to get my name out there, to get people to even like look at a portfolio and
Yeah.
like to understand it. I feel I feel like they they can understand it to only a certain level. Like these people in power at these institutions like art museums and art galleries that don't understand, that never had the struggle.
Right. Hmm. Yeah. So, um, how do you think like the audience who haven't had similar experiences can also relate? Because like like art is like universal and stuff. So how do you
Mhm.
yeah, so yeah, what do you think?
I think that it art is universal, and it can be understand without words, you
Hmm.
know? Like you can look at something and have an emotion or have a feeling attached to it. And also I'm at a point that I also don't think it's my job or responsibility to explain this, or like um to teach people. Like there's so many sources of knowledge out there. We have the internet for a reason. It's not our jobs to be a teacher to these people. If
Hmm.
they want to understand it, they should do the research. And that goes like not only for like Vietnamese art, but like for like Black art, for
Right.
like Latino art. Like we don't have to. And like this is another thing, like being in an institution that, because my school at U of H is predominantly white professors
Hmm.
who don't get it, or they tokenize it, you know.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm like, I don't want to be a token. I don't want to be like your pity party. Like,
Yeah.
oh, so
Yeah.
like there's like a point in my like art career at universities and these institutions where I'm like, I'm not going to show you anything. I'm just going to do my work. And if you don't understand it, then you don't understand it.
Yeah.
Like, I remember there was one critique where the professor was like, I can't understand your grandma. It was a video of my grandma like
Oh,
telling her story. And she was already doing enough by speaking in English.
yeah.
And I was like, she's doing so much speaking English. I'm not going to put subtitles on it to make your life easier.
Yeah.
It shouldn't, like, this stuff is traumatic. Like, I'm not going to accommodate the white person so they can get it. Like, she's speaking English already, the language that you already know. Why should I make it easier for you?
Right. Yeah. Like the school system should at least teach us better in the beginning, you know? There's like many instances where, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, institutions.
Yeah, so like Houston is so diverse, but you mentioned how like art and like art institutions, those spaces are mainly like dominated by white people. How do you think um why do you think Asian Americans haven't really had their voice represented in the art scene?
I think I think it's derived from how art has always been white, or has always been like stolen from other cultures, other different histories.
Hmm.
Like the whole art museum is just literally stolen art from
Yeah.
around the world if
Yeah.
you think about it.
Hmm.
And I think also it's also like our generation now, the like Vietnamese people just got to America like 40 years ago.
Hmm.
So it's their kids who are the new voices,
Right.
who are who were so lucky enough to have the opportunity to have an education, to go to school. So I think now more than ever, like Vietnamese artists are getting more vocal and are getting more out there and being wanted to be heard, because now we have the chance. Like, our parents were working just to survive, and now we're here and we can thrive.
Hmm. Yeah, for sure. So, what would you want the Houston art scene to be like in the future?
I think, like, overall, I think the Houston art scene does have institutions that are really great, like Project Row Houses, Diverse Works.
Hmm.
Um, like, these institutions, they're they're growing, and like they're showing different works by different people from all different backgrounds. I think it's mostly the bigger institutions
Right. Yeah.
that have that are more strict and like mostly show like all these white artists
Hmm.
from all
Right.
over that went to like Ivy League schools.
Hmm.
But Houston has such a big art community, and we have such amazing art that we just need a space that will show them. So I hope in the future we have more spaces, and the directors to be more diverse, to show more diverse work, hopefully, which is like, change is going to take time
Right.
for sure.
Mhm.
But I see it changing as I'm currently making work, and like
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm happy that I think this generation now is more vocal and like takes more of a stance
Right.
for bettering and for change.
Hmm. And do you think that um, the Asian American artist community is in a similar situation with other people of color, or do you think that other people of color, like Black and Latino artists, are in a different situation?
I think we're all in the same situations, but we all have different avenues and different ways of approaching the situation
Right. Yeah.
too. And like growing their own community, like I feel like Asian American artists don't really have like a community together, or
Mhm.
it's either separated, like different ranges of art, like different ranges of people, like Vietnamese artists, the Filipino artists, like
Right.
the Chinese artists. But
Mhm.
I don't think there's like a community that's all together.
Hmm. Yeah. So, what is your perspective on labels? Like some artists, they don't think of themselves as, say, like a Chinese artist, or like they identify themselves as like an international artist. So, what is your perspective on being labeled as like an Asian American artist or anything?
I kind of reclaimed it. Like at first I didn't, cuz and another thing is like my name is very American, Brandon Harris.
Mm-hmm.
So I recently been going by Brandon Tall Harris, which
Hmm.
is my middle name. And my dad, when he came, he took his stepdad's last name, making my last name Harris.
Hmm.
But I also feel like that's like giving back and like a simulation itself.
Yeah. Hmm.
So I like for me, I'm proud to be like Asian American and like a Vietnamese artist, and I think it's important to like say that because it's not often heard of.
Right. Hmm.
Like there's maybe like a handful of like major like Vietnamese artists out there.
Yeah,
But other than that, like everyone else is just like a working artist.
for sure. Yeah. Mhm. So, I know you mentioned your grandma a lot. Would you say she's been like a role model for you, or she's like impacted your life a lot?
Yeah, my grandma my grandma's definitely a role model to me. She's just so brave and so strong. She when she escaped the war, she had like four kids on her running to like the beach,
Oh my
and
God.
they all like range from like 2 years old to 10 years old, and like her whole journey. And she even like was teaching people how to like shoot machine guns
Oh
in
my God.
Vietnam, like
Yeah.
during the war. Like she's such a she's such a strong character, and like
Mhm.
she's vocal too.
Yeah. Okay. So beyond your artwork, how do you think your identity has affected your career or like any other aspects of life?
I think I think my identity is definitely informing my career and my artist practice.
Mhm.
Um, like I've growing up, I kind of was not like I kind of wanted to assimilate, I guess,
Mhm.
because I was being around the people that I was around. So
Right.
I think now I'm impacted by my identity more and like kind of reclaiming this identity, and especially like now I think it's important as Asian Americans to stand with the Black Lives Matters movement. Because like even the history back then, like Black Lives Matters always fought for like Asian Americans, and like the Black Panthers and the Asian Americans all stood side by side.
Yeah.
So I think like this current protests that are going on is so important for us Asian Americans to stand in solidarity with the Black Lives Matters, especially in Houston, since George Floyd was from Houston.
Mhm. Yeah, for sure. So, I've seen like a lot of people my age like advocating a lot to their family and like online. So, what do you think about the younger generation, like of Asian Americans? Like, I know you've talked about how you think we're more vocal and stuff, but yeah, would you want to expand upon that?
Yeah, I think there's like two groups of Asian Americans in this generation. There's like the ones that are like the ones that are like not vocal and like just almost like it's almost like the my like I forgot what it's called. The model minority.
Yeah, yeah.
Like there's definitely some people that like are very like that, but there's also some people that are very vocal and very like passionate and want to make a statement.
Hmm.
So I guess it just depends on the person.
Right. Yeah. Hmm. And yeah, to switch gears a bit, I want to talk about the recent impact of COVID-19 and like the wave of anti-Asian harassment and xenophobia. What is your perspective on this?
Yeah. The pandemic has been so insane. The first month I didn't leave my house other to get like groceries and stuff. And
Yeah.
especially like seeing on like the news and like people being harassed and attacked for being Asian, and it's just been so psycho, so
Yeah.
psychotic.
Yeah.
And I don't know, I think there's a lot of Asian Americans that are quiet or like try to like back down from
Mhm.
it and like not to instigate it. But
Yeah.
I think it's definitely important to like stand up to this for
Mhm.
sure.
Yeah. I've also seen like a lot of like Asian Americans saying like, "Oh, we just have to work harder to show that we're American as well." Like to
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, like we don't owe anyone anything to be American.
Yeah.
Like
You have to
and
prove it.
America was founded on stolen lands.
Yeah.
Like we're just as American as everyone else.
Mhm.
And like it's so frustrating. And like yeah, I just I just don't get it. And like and all these people that are complaining about it and like blaming Asians for it, they're also like eating Asian food. Like, oh, they
Right.
love pho, huh?
Yeah.
They're like, oh, want to get some pho?
Yeah, oh my God, yeah. This is like a little off tangent, but like recently Asian food has like I've like taken over the food scene, I'd say, like a lot in Houston and
Yeah,
stuff. And what do you think about that? Like especially like when you're growing up, like people would be like, "Oh, like that's disgusting," but now it's like so popularized.
I think it's more. I think there's some people that are like, oh, like we're cultured, like we eat ethnic food or whatever. But I definitely think it's great that
Mhm.
there's an acceptance of like Asian American food and like Vietnamese food. And I think Vietnamese there's so much Vietnamese restaurants in Houston.
Yeah.
So I think it's almost like a sense of pride that they're still here. They're doing what they did when they first got here, and they're still around and they will be around forever.
Yeah. And like yeah, all the new restaurants are like great. Like
Yeah.
yeah, it's like awesome.
Right?
Yeah.
Love it.
Yeah, back to the current there's like current anti-Asian sentiment. There's also like police brutality riots and Black
Yeah.
Lives Matter movement. What do
And I
you
think they go hand in hand
Yeah.
too. So I'm actually going to the Black Lives Matter protest right after this.
Oh, well, yeah.
But I went to one earlier this week too, and it's just
Mhm.
like it's so important because their struggle is also like our struggle
Right.
too. Like
Solidarity. Yeah.
yeah, like we are all minorities and we're all faced with the same struggle, and we all need to stand together and fight. And
Mhm.
it's so like it's so sad, like this has been going on forever and nothing has changed. Like you can look back to like the 60s and like the Black Panther and the civil rights movement, and they're saying the same things that we're saying today.
Yeah.
And like right now there's like 60,000 Houstonians downtown
Right.
protesting, and it's it's so important that we stand together and we're not taking this anymore.
Yeah, for sure.
And like when the and especially with like being Asian American and like what we have gone through, we need to show our solidarity with
Mhm.
the Black Lives Matters movement as well. And I think that this pandemic issues and the police brutality issues they go hand in hand.
Yeah.
And like we're all sticking together and
Mhm.
we all are here and we're vocal and we want change.
Yeah. So, yeah, how was that when you were protesting, how was that? Like what did you see?
It was like I've been to other Black Lives Matter protests, but this one definitely stood out and was different. Like normally we were confined to like the sidewalks and like,
Mhm.
but this time I think there was just like such a loud and vocal crowd that they took over the streets, and we were like blocking off traffic. And
Mhm.
like the police were a little aggressive, and
Mhm.
like other people like driving were a little aggressive. Like my
Yeah.
friend was almost hit by this truck.
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Yeah, and then right as after it happened, we all just like started hitting this truck and hitting their boat that was attached to them.
Yeah.
And like and like people, and I don't understand how people are like, oh, like these riots, don't, like they shouldn't like break into these these
Target.
corporations. And
Yeah.
yeah, but if you look back in history, revolutions have always been violent,
Right.
and like if you don't understand it, then you don't get what they're fighting for then,
Right.
and like what they've gone through.
Hmm. And
So yeah, it's definitely, and I also see like, especially with the George Floyd, like the video, there was like an Asian man
yeah, the cop.
who was standing there and not doing anything and not acting. So I think it's important that our Asian and American community stand in solidarity with them, to show them like we do care. Like it's not like he might be a cop, but like who cares about cops? They fucking suck.
Yeah. Yeah. I think like it's I think it's like what's unique about this is that, or there's many things, but like it's an opportunity for a lot of people to like talk to their families who are like maybe like older generation,
hmm
especially about this.
Because there's a lot of like anti-blackness in these older generations,
Hmm.
and I think I'm not too sure, but I feel like it maybe is derived from like their background being in like these countries that there weren't any black people in.
Hmm. Yeah.
So I think when they came to America, like they see this and it's foreign to them.
Hmm.
But I think it's definitely, it's our job to teach them
Right.
this.
Hmm. Yeah, and like the whole like model minority myth being like
hmm
turned against Asians, like turn them like against like Black Americans as well. Like,
Exactly.
yeah.
Like, and like I just don't understand. Like it's like their struggle is so important. They've helped our struggle so much as well. So
Yeah.
we just all have to stick together and do something. And I think now it's something's happening. Like it's different. I feel like we've been through this police brutality so much that like enough is enough. Like I think people who didn't protest, like Trayvon Martin, like those, like the people now are finally understanding because how vocal the community is now.
Hmm. For sure. Like, I know, like, I mean, yeah, a lot of Asian Americans have been very vocal, but then you also see some Asian Americans who are like, oh, Black Americans didn't stand up for us during COVID, even though that's not really true. And what do you think about that?
Yeah, I just think I think I think because what we went through during COVID wasn't as, it's like not to like discredit what we've gone through during COVID, but
Mhm.
it I don't think it compares to like the injustice that they've gone through, like,
Mhm.
and how much injustice that African Americans have gone through. Like us as Asian Americans, like if we're walking down the street, we're not going to get stopped most of the time, like we're
Mhm.
not going to be like antagonized, and we're not, and like most of the times we're not going to be like attacked by a cop.
Right. It's like
So yeah,
different situations, I think.
yeah, it's like a whole different situation.
Mhm.
So like when the whole COVID happened, like it wasn't as bad like as other other races has gone through.
Mhm.
And I think that's also like the minority myth as well, because I think white America perceives us as like submissive, and like
Mhm.
perceives us as like, yeah, as submissive, like we're not, like we're just going to like be compliant to everything.
Yeah, like non-vocal, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, um, how do you think the art scene will be impacted by COVID-19 and um the march, like Black Lives Matter movement?
Yeah, so I think like right now a lot of shows and exhibitions were canceled, or like they're moving to an online platform,
Mhm.
which I think the online platform is good because it provides art to people who aren't able to see art typically, or like gives them a bigger platform to showcase art throughout the world.
Mm.
I don't know how the art scene will recover. I know like a lot of institutions rely on like exhibitions and like art sales to stay afloat, but without this, we're kind of all like wondering, and like I guess we'll just have to wait and find out.
Yeah.
But yeah, like it's hard. It's hard for them, and I hope that they make a recovery,
Hmm.
which I think they will. I think there's a lot of donations coming in during this time right now for the art scene, and a lot of generosity from other people and like donors as well.
That's good. Yeah. To backtrack a little bit, in recent and upcoming films and TV, we've had some pretty great Asian representation, like Crazy Rich
Hmm.
Asians, The Farewell, Parasite, and the upcoming, I think Avatar and The Last Airbender TV
Hmm.
show. So, in what other areas do you think there has to be greater Asian American representation?
Definitely art for sure. I think that music is slowly like becoming one
Yeah,
of them too. I
yeah.
think like the popularity of like Asian music is coming in
Mhm.
too. Yeah, I don't know. I think it's just like a slow process. Like we're like Parasite was insane. Such a
Yeah.
great movie, and I was shocked that they won. I
Yeah, yeah.
I was not expecting that.
Mhm.
And I think we're on a track for progression, but it will take time.
Yeah, for sure. Mhm. Um, so that's the end of my questions. Do you have any other thoughts that you would like to share?
Um no, just keep on the lookout for my
Yeah.
show. So
Yeah, yeah.
hopefully we'll be up, like our institutions will be back up and running, so
Mhm,
I can like find a space to have my show either the end of the year or next year,
mhm.
hopefully. But yeah, I just hope that it will all work out.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay, well, I hope you'll be well on your protest today. Be safe.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It was nice speaking with you.
Yeah, same with you. Okay.
Cool.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for taking the time to be interviewed by Ha. I think Anne will be in conversation with you for like the exhibit that we're trying to do this fall as well. Yeah.
Okay,
Thank you
cool.
so much.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.